This community update was brought to you by U Radio. Domestic and gender-based violence remains pervasive and constant for many in our communities. Women's shelters are often the first point of safety and support, yet the demand for these spaces exceeds available resources. Shelters across Canada and closer to home in Winnipeg frequently report operating at or above capacity. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the frequency and severity of domestic violence has increased, with the surge overwhelming many shelters, forcing staff to make heartbreaking decisions about whom they can accommodate, says Sungai Munvingi Van Ladegam, Provincial Coordinator for the Manitoba Association of Women's Shelters.
Our shelters are operating consistently at or over capacity since the pandemic, which is something very challenging because how do you turn someone away? We're like, our shelters are full, we can't add any more.
One of the biggest challenges is accessibility in rural and remote areas, where transportation and internet access barriers make it harder for people to seek help. Despite these obstacles, shelters continue their vital work with dedicated but overburdened staff. North Point Douglas Women's Centre in Winnipeg is an example of the impact a dedicated resource can have. Kalida Benedictson, Manager of Operations at North Point Douglas Women's Centre, explains that the centre provides everything from crisis intervention to long-term programs promoting healing and empowerment. Each of these programs is vital for the community, with Benedictson explaining although rates of violence do fluctuate, it remains a constant.
I would say even conservatively that we see someone who is experiencing domestic violence or gender-based violence in that way at least once a week, if not more. We have people disclose once or twice a month, and then we will actually see an immediate emergency situation with like fresh injuries and things like that, probably once or twice a year. And that's too much.
This highlights the desperate need for these centers, as these situations can be incredibly traumatic and stressful.
Those times where people are quite literally like running to the door because they need a place to be safe, and then we're immediately locking it and clearing the space. Those are challenging for everyone involved. And our biggest priority in those times is to sit with that person and to let them be in the driver's seat.
Despite staff efforts, shelters face significant challenges. Funding is often insufficient, and the housing crisis complicates matters. With limited affordable housing, many who experience violence have nowhere to go after leaving shelters. Addressing domestic and gender-based violence requires a multi-pronged approach. Governments must increase funding for shelter operations and prioritize legislation reforms that protect survivors. Investment in transportation services and mental health resources is vital for rural areas.
Many people don't recognize and understand that abuse can happen to anyone. It's not limited to one group or one community. It is unfortunately spread across community, both in urban settings and in rural settings. This issue is a community issue. It's not a behind closed doors problem.
Public education is equally essential. Awareness campaigns that dismantle harmful myths such as, "Why don't they just leave?" can shift societal attitudes and empower people to seek help. Teaching youth about healthy relationships and respect can also break cycles of violence before they take root.
It's so vital to have these conversations and to bring awareness to it because it can often hide in plain sight. Abuse by nature is about power. And when someone seeks power over another, they tend to isolate them. They present a different face to the rest of the world. So a lot of people are completely flabbergasted when they hear that someone has been through this situation with a partner that they also know. Any type of gender-based violence can take so many forms. It can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional or psychological, it can be financial, and that goes towards the isolation piece as well.
Women's shelters are indispensable in the fight against domestic and gender-based violence, but they cannot tackle this crisis alone. Through systemic reforms, increased funding, and collective community action, a society can be created where people can access immediate safety and the long-term support they need to rebuild their lives. You're listening to U Radio, where diverse voices connect. Stay tuned for more stories and insights that matter. With U Multicultural and the Local Journalism Initiative, I'm Ryan Funk.